Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro. Thanks for tuning in. As we find ourselves in this new normal, we have seen long-standing agendas, which have remained behind the scenes, hidden away from the public, now being offered as solutions justified by this crisis. The World Economic Forum's Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution are perfect examples of this. Today, we will dive deeper into this agenda and also focus on how it may reshape our lives if the technocrats have their way. Now, joining me today is John Kleisick, who is an adjunct professor with a master's in English who has taught college rhetoric and research argumentations for 8 years. His literary scholarship concentrates on the history of global eugenics and Aldous Huxley's dystopic novel Brave New World. He is the author of the book School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. John Kleisick is a contributor to the Activist Post, Counter Markets, Center for Research on Globalization, and many, many others, including davidike.com. He is also the director of writing and editing at Black Freighter Productions Books. He holds a black belt in classical Taekwondo and is a certified kickboxing instructor under the International Muay Thai Boxing Association. John Kleisick, thanks so much for taking the time to be my guest.
Thanks for having me, Spiro. Honored to be here.
Now, the social engineers have for generations used the strategy of indoctrination to target society's most impressionable minds, our children, through many ways, but primarily through our education systems. Now, in addition to your fantastic book, which I have yet to read, but I've been hearing people raving about it, like Richie Allen when you were on with his show, that's when I first became aware of you. Now, you also have a new article out, which is currently available in the Counter Markets newsletter that focuses on the technocrats' plan to reshape the education system and therefore basically reshape the future of humanity. Now, your article is titled Cradle to Career. COVID lockdown has accelerated the path to AI learning and the technocratic workforce. Now, lots of important information in this article, and it starts out how in 1982, a special advisor to the Department of Education's Office of Research and Improvement blew the whistle on Project BEST. Now, can you explain to us what Project BEST is? Is it still active today? And why did this special advisor to the Department of Education blow the whistle on it?
Okay, so Project BEST it's an acronym. BEST stands for Better Education Skills Through Technology. It was part of Reagan's private sector initiative, and basically it planned to use public-private partnerships to basically merge the government with the corporate sector using what back then was called the Skinner box technology. And so it's basically based on B.F. Skinner's adaptive learning or operant conditioning, stimulus response conditioning. Okay, so those are all acronyms that basically mean the same thing. Why Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt is the person who blew the whistle. She wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. And basically, when she brought it up to the department, she basically said, "Hey, this sounds like corporate fascism to me." And they basically said, "Well, we didn't really think about it like that, Charlotte." And then the other part was that, on top of or built into that fascistic apparatus was going to be basically you're going to change classical education. So you're going to change education from the art of learning, and you're going to change it to a science of psychological conditioning that'll be facilitated by big technology companies. And so she basically saw this as not in line with, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and human rights and things like that.
Now, we've seen throughout history, great change typically follows a great crisis, as we have seen played out many times, the Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. Now, it seems we are witnessing many solutions being rolled out in response to this crisis. What are some of the examples of how the education system will be, reshaped in response to this crisis?
Okay, so basically what we're going to see is the next phase of Project BEST being rolled out. Okay. And so one of the simplest ways you can see that is through something called the new distance learning regulations, the federal regulations. So the specific rules are the code is 85 FR 18638. Basically, what this is going to do is deregulate the rules for what they call distance learning. That means online learning or virtual learning. Okay. And so once upon a time, you had to have particular certificate to teach online. So what they did right away when they went on lockdown, they said everybody's got to teach, they got to convert their classes online. Well, a lot of people didn't have those certs, so they basically relaxed the rules for that. But also, if you take a look at that those federal regulations, you'll see in those clauses three particular agendas. Okay, so one is called competency-based education. Another is called direct instruction, and then another is called the adaptive learning software, okay, which they refer to as artificial intelligence, okay. So basically, the three of them all together means this. Instead of a human teacher needing to actually provide the feedback, you can have the AI do that with the adaptive learning algorithms. They can provide the direct instruction, and it can be on a competency-based process. So what that means is instead of there being a semester-long process by which you have to complete so much material, usually it's 16 weeks, but they've got all these different flex blocks and summer classes that are truncated. What it means is, let's say the student wants to move faster or slower. Well, then the student only has to learn a certain amount of competency at a certain pace, which means you don't have to actually facilitate it in a classroom. You can do it on a subscription basis through these technology companies. Okay, so basically, the DeVos department has deregulated the oversight on distance learning. And basically what that's going to do is facilitate all of the big technology companies that came out of Project BEST to basically plug in the Skinner box software. Okay, so again, B.F. Skinner, he came up with his stuff. His theory of conditioning was called operant conditioning. It's just another mode of older stimulus response conditioning. If you take that theory and you plug it into digital computers, it's what we have is the adaptive learning software. Okay, the companies that are facilitating it, one of the biggest ones would be K-12 Inc. Okay, so if you go back to who set up Project BEST, it would have been Secretary of Education T.H. Bell. The next year, he hands off the project to Secretary Bill Bennett. Bill Bennett is the person that set up K-12 Inc. K-12 Inc. was also funded by Betsy DeVos. And then you have Betsy DeVos meeting privately with Peter Thiel, who funds adaptive learning software, in particular Newton and Clever. And Peter Thiel was also the speechwriter for Bill Bennett. Okay, so you got all the people that basically set up Project BEST are hanging out together, and they're going to basically get a windfall of federal dollars through this, not just through the CARES Act, but by deregulating the rules so that they can get more CARES stimulus money. So that's basically how the current situation, the current Hegelian dialectic. Naomi Klein has a big article. It's called "The Screen New Deal." Don't exactly agree with her ideas about the contact tracing, but she gets it right on basically how they're going to use tech and surveillance capitalism through something called disaster capitalism. Okay, which builds on this thing called creative destruction and disruptive technology. So basically, right, they're using this disaster of the COVID crisis to problem, reaction, solution, get all their companies to get a windfall of this money, and that's where we're at.
Well, this is very concerning. We know that big tech in general has probably far more influence over our lives right now than most people will even be aware of or acknowledge or even think about. For example, Google basically has a lot of influence on shaping your perception of reality because people always say, "Oh, let's just Google it," and so however they set up their algorithms can affect what kind of information you're getting. And then now this AI and these tech companies are moving into the schools, which, I want to get into a little bit more here. But basically, we know that big tech, Silicon Valley technocrats are involved. And I just have to ask, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation involved? Because it seems no matter what rock you look under, you find Bill and Melinda Gates.
Yeah, and in my book, they're in basically every chapter. And, when I first started talking about the book, Bill and Melinda Gates have been doing I've been doing things like this for a long time, right? So it's kind of like old hat. I wanted to focus on like Neuralink, which I think we'll talk about later, and some of the newer companies. So I didn't really mention Gates a lot. And then after COVID, I'm like, okay, so I need to start, referencing Gates again and not just not just what's going down now, but my website has 66 Gates Foundation grants that were put up before COVID. Okay, since COVID, I looked at 203 grants. I looked at more than 203, but there was 203 in which there was over $250 million of Gates Foundation money spent out for a range of different educational assistance during COVID crisis. And that ranged from everything from the adaptive learning software to other big data mining projects, workforce training projects, but also funding universities to help with COVID research and vaccine development. So I included those as well because it's part of the public-private edu-corporate apparatus. So, the Gates Foundation, they set up something called the Reimagine Education, got a lot of pushback on it, and so you don't really hear a lot about it in the mainstream press. So I figured the best way that anybody's going to figure out what exactly that is to dig through those grants, which is what I did. So interesting thing is first that the Reimagine Education project, it uses the same language as one of the CARES Act competitions. So the CARES Act wants to hand out money not just for the adaptive learning software, which automates teaching with AI, but it also wants to give you money through a competition called Reimagining Workforce Preparation. So for what's geared towards the stimulus response is that conditioning is geared not necessarily towards academic learning, but towards what job they want to put you in, right? So your school is now an engine of corporate training or workforce training for big companies with big tech on top. Okay, so they're using the same language here to pump basically the same agendas, workforce training through the adaptive learning software. Okay, so what did I pick up when I dug into the actual Gates Foundation grants? Well, first thing I should mention is that, right, the New York partnership is this, right? It has Governor Cuomo, Eric Schmidt sitting on is the chair of the Blue Ribbon Commission, and then it's getting some partnership money with the Gates Foundation. Okay, so those are your three key players. So if you dig around in the Gates Foundation grants, you can see some money going out to an institution called Innovate EDU. Innovate EDU is a New York-based nonprofit. Innovate EDU is setting up basically an app, a network that will allow schools to aggregate all their data into something, all their Google Classroom data into something called BigQuery. And so basically what you have is a partnership with a New York-based nonprofit, the Google Corporation, funded by the Gates Foundation. Now, what does this database look like? Well, basically it looks like something that is now defunct. It's called In Bloom. Okay, In Bloom was basically it had contracts with an Amazon cloud that was ran on a server by News Corp. And basically it wanted to put all the student data into this one cloud. And people were like, whoa, okay, that looks, that seems a little too much data aggregation. So they got a bunch of pushback, lawsuits and stuff like that. By the way, that was also funded by the Gates Foundation. Okay. And then later they came up with something called LearnSphere. And LearnSphere was like, well, it's not In Bloom. It's like In Bloom, but we don't put it all in one database. It's distributed, and you can kind of, there's some firewalls in there, and there's some negotiation about who gets access to what data. But it's largely built on the same process, and the originator, Kettinger at Carnegie Mellon, will basically tell you it's essentially the same idea. Okay. And so what's the idea there? Well, as I mentioned, as I document in my book, it's basically to develop AI. Okay. And so it's basically they're going to take all that data, all the student data, all the teaching data, all the learning data, all that cognitive behavioral data, and also what they call socio-emotional learning data. Okay, so the students' thinking algorithms and the students' feeling algorithms, they're going to take all that data and they're going to use it not just to develop better ed tech products, so better adaptive learning software and things like that, but also to develop basically down the line AGI, or artificial general intelligence, so to develop, basically an artificial consciousness, something that, because the adaptive learning software, which is based on Skinnerian stimulus response algorithms, right? It's super sophisticated, but it only does that. Okay, it can't decide to, one day get up and, stop doing that, or it can't extrapolate out into other algorithms, right? Natural language, etc. And so they want to take all of basically the student and teaching learning data through the developmental stages and use that to run through their AI algorithms, right? And I should note that those federal regulations or deregulations, of which IBM has a member sitting on on the chair, basically they say that they can't keep up with the AI deregulation or the AI evolution fast enough. So what there's a clause in there that basically says we don't have to give you prior approval to push the new algorithm forward. Okay, so they've already created the loopholes where basically they can take this data and crunch it for whatever advances in technology they want to use. So that's the core of how the Gates Foundation is involved in this disaster capitalist Hegelian dialectic. There's also, I should mention that the Innovate EDU uses the language as well of reimagining education, and they also use the language of disrupting education, or using disruptive technologies. Okay, and so that comes out of this philosopher Joseph Schumpeter, who basically said that you could, the economic boom bust cycles could be manipulated, or that basically they would like a Hegelian dialectic, be pushed forward through these new technologies that would remove the old industry or the old labor force and replace it with something else. And so the Gates Foundation funds the Disruptive Institute, or Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Technology. So again, right, they're dumping money into all of this stuff. It's using the same language. It's all the key players involved. And I should just mention one more thing, is that there's also a reimagining policing movement now as well, okay, which at the end of this dialectic is going to be a bunch of stuff like databases, facial recognition cameras, through something called community-oriented policing. And I actually, before all this stuff went down, I wrote an article for Activist Post called Socio-Emotional Thought Crimes in American Schools, where I talked about how the racial disparities in discipline in schools would be used similarly to the racial disparities in policing to set up a new data tracking system in which, right, the algorithms will decide who gets what punishments, and they're already using them for no cash bail, or that will be what becomes no cash bail. They're already using them to sentence people, and so instead of basically providing money, it'll just be they're going to look at your payment histories, your work history, education. They'll look at all that data and say, how much of a risk are you? This will be the new policing system that plugs into all the rest of it. And it's basically social credit.
Yes, exactly. The social credit. As the World Economic Forum did come out recently and announce basically, this great reset. And then you go back, they say it's going to include the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and you go back and look at their own words on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and they're talking about building a new construct, a new social contract, and that's going to be tied into these smart cities. And I mean, this, Agenda 21, and I mean, it's unbelievable to see this actually rolling out. And when you're talking about these AI algorithms being introduced into these schools, and essentially how big tech and the technocrats are taking over education, if they haven't already, to reshape education, and how children, like basically the AI is going to be teaching these kids to fill positions in the new technocratic dictatorship era that we're moving into, and which is unbelievable. This is extremely important information, and it's happening. I don't think many people are aware of it, that it's happening. I mean, it's rolling out right now. These programs are in the works right now, and this crisis is being used to justify the implementation of these long-standing agendas. Now, I wanted to ask you specifically about Elon Musk. A lot of people really like him. They think he's so cool, and he's like, he goes on Joe Rogan's show and smokes pot, smokes weed, and, initially he was warning against AI and how it's a threat to humanity, just like Stephen Hawking was before he passed away. But now Elon Musk says basically if you can't beat him, join him. He did a complete 180. And I want to get your take on why the flip-flop. Why did now he is endorsing this Neuralink project, or running it essentially, and he's announcing next month that there's going to be in August a major announcement in regards to the Neuralink project, which wants to implant microchips into people's heads and connect them to AI. And he's launching a network of satellites to blanket the Earth with 5G, which is going to be part of the operating system of this new fourth industrial revolution. Is going to be 5G and AI. But like, why the flip-flop with Elon Musk, and what's his whole deal?
That's a good question. I like the way you posed it, because one of my solutions is, to bring back classical learning. And one of the basic principles of classical learning, which believe it or not, it's not taught anymore, is the principle of non-contradiction. So you don't have to have all kinds of degrees and fancy this or that to understand when someone contradicts themselves, right? I mean, you only need to track, you said this A, you said this B, those two things are opposite. They can't both exist. So, right, what's underneath that? I mean, it could be that maybe he was sincere and, was doing his best to, argue or, send the message that he was, that we need to stop AI. And then maybe everybody just went along with it anyway. So then he came up with his neural link to, as the second solution, because, hey, if you can't beat it, then I guess, you should try to adapt to it. But, then again, as you point out, then why build it in the first place, right? And he's setting up his space fence and things like that. And he's out of the PayPal mafia. I mean, so he comes from a group of people that made their money on data extraction, basically. And, I mean, he might make green cars or things like that. But like you mentioned with the Agenda 21 stuff, that's not, we're all going back to, farming and living like indigenous people. Like that means like, all that stuff's going to be reserved for mass production, and you're going to be in a smart city on social credit, and your neural link will, so you don't have to carry them. A face shield around. Of course, I guess we're halfway there already, right? I got the face mask and some people with the the face shields, but that's essentially what it'll be, and so I think it's a PR game, I guess, rhetorical play. They got to have somebody that maybe seems like they're pushing back against it in the seat, I guess that's what I would say. Yeah.
That makes sense, especially when you see, Musk kind of pushing back against the lockdowns, and the lockdowns and everything like that. And people praise him for it. And they're like, yes, he's standing against the system of control. But he's helping to build this system of control. And it's specifically the technologies which will be utilized by it. John, you have done brilliant work exposing the technocratic transhumanist agenda. Where do you see this going? Like, is this inevitable that man will be merged with machines, as the World Economic Forum says they will be, and how they're going to get access to our thoughts and get access to our emotions, and how they're going to have to build a safe construct for us to be able to operate and think in? And, like Elon Musk says, if you can't beat him, join it.
I mean, it's certainly... I mean, Ed Opperman asked me about a month before the COVID stuff, like how long this was out. And, I was like, they say singularity is like 2035, 2045, somewhere in that range-ish. And, so I was going by those numbers. And like you say, like we're like at the point with, contact tracing, I've said it many times, is the beginning of social credit, because they're basically they're gonna take they want to blur your biohealth records with basically, your employment records, and at the schools they're talking about taking your temperatures and things. Well, where does that data go after you take it? And so does it get sent to some contact tracing database? And then, so is there law enforcement involved that needs to check up on these people? So now you've merged criminal justice, healthcare, education, workforce all into one database. And that's basically, if anybody wants to see what it looks like, that's social credit. Just take a look at what it looks like in China. There's been several documentaries. I mean, to see the facial recognition and all that stuff, to actually see them walking around, and it's one thing to talk about it. I mean, that part looks like we're pretty much there. I mean, I like to think that, you know, we still have rights regardless of what system they build. I mean, but it's up to you and I to exercise that. And, you know, some of that might require you to, you know, part ways with a job or something like that if, you know, you don't want to go along with whatever their particular new regulations are. I mean, what's happening right now, which I've noticed in some of the places where I work, is, you know, people with good intentions, they just, you know, they want to plug in all the software because we're stuck here. So, you know, I mean, we got to do something for the kids, and then we don't want anybody to get sick. So, but, you know, I'm not seeing anybody asking questions about what are we doing with this data? Where is it going? How does this apply? Does this violate HIPAA? Does this violate FERPA? Does it violate other, you know, criminal justice restrictions? Like, is it inevitable? I don't believe that. I can't believe that. I believe in, you know, I believe in a higher power and all that type of stuff. And you know, I believe that history has got us going somewhere. I don't think it's got us going nowhere, you know, just to crash and burn. So it probably will get a lot worse before anybody starts to, you know, maybe turn the boat around. But I don't think that at any moment in time, we just have, you know, all you have to do is not use the technology, not act. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to find other avenues to, you know, to be a human being. And but again, I mean, that you have to make a decision then, because, you know, I mean, you're gonna have to part with some of these things, you know, so.
And you know, I mean, definitely people. I always believe, and I'm not trying to tell people what to do. Obviously, it's people are individuals, and it's there to choose for themselves. But, you know, I believe that everyone, and the more people that do it, the better. But everyone needs to resist tyranny in all its forms, and not just keep your mouth shut and go along because it'll go away and get better. You know, this is a slippery slope that is, I believe, they're conditioning us for the next phases, for the next stages. They're softening us up with some of these mandates and requirements right now under this new normal system that is eventually, like you said, John, going to encompass every aspect of our life, and it's all going to be digitalized and probably in some form of biometric, if not implanted into us. You know, people think that it's crazy. Oh, you know, if you know, you talk about you know, the vaccines and stuff, and if you're a crazy anti-vaxxer and you know, but they are literally talking about putting microchips. This is Elon Musk, not through a vaccine, but putting microchips in people's brains to connect them to artificial intelligence. And you think that these technocrats won't use this technology to benefit themselves or try to manipulate you or control you? So I've covered some of this before. I know you've done fantastic work on this. Are there any final points that you'd like to make, or anything that we may have missed that you'd like to mention?
Just because you mentioned it, I like to say this, you know, so to tie all that together, look, if they can mandate you to get a vaccine in order to go back to work or to participate in the public sphere, and they've set the legal precedent that they can put stuff in your body for the purposes of regulating public health. Now, when they change policing to algorithms and mental health professionals, and the social worker comes up and they use the DSM-4 instead of the Bill of Rights to say that you're mentally ill, well, they'll give you a Neuralink chip that'll go ahead and modify your algorithms in your brain to make them mentally healthy for the better good of the public health. And they'll be able to do that because it's okay to alter your biology for the sake of the greater good. So no, it's not crazy, and all the stuff is getting set up right now. And to tie back into education, don't think that if a student, you know, is writing on their digital module and they have opinions that they think is mentally unhealthy, that might not go into any of those databases. And so, no, it's not crazy. But again, you know, if we could start with, I really mean this. This is sincere. It seems so subtle, but the principle of non-contradiction, because the stuff they want us to do right now, they're contradicting themselves constantly on the masks, on the efficacy of the tests, on how they calculate the deaths. Okay, you don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to have an authoritative expertise to say you said this, then you said that. They don't go together. It can't be. It's got to be one or the other. And at this point, you've demonstrated that you're not reliable. So now I'm going to make up my own decision. So that's what I would like to leave on.
Well said. Absolutely well said. And, this is part of the reason why I have been myself pushing back so heavily on the masks and on that issue, because, it starts with masks. What's next? What's next? So in the name of the greater good, the public health, they're trying to justify it, trying to shame you into it, have others shame you into it. And don't fall for the trap. Of course, I'm always respectful of others, especially if I'm out in public or whatever. I'm not trying to be a jerk about it. But hey, you know what? My immune system's doing just fine. There's a lot of information out there that shows that they're not as not effective. And there are a lot of studies. Anyways, I don't want to go down to that rabbit hole. But just essentially, it starts with masks. Next, vaccines, and then Neuralink microchips. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but this is the road we are heading down. And if you do the research, and Mr. John Gleisick, you have done the research, you've written the book on it. Fantastic having you on today. Definitely, I'd like to thank all of the viewers out there who watch and share these reports, and I would certainly like to thank Mr. John Gleisick for being my guest today. And I will be sure to leave links for your site, which is schoolworldorder.info, where you can find John Gleisick's book. And I'll also leave a link for the Counter Markets newsletter, July edition, and that has this recent article in there that's extremely important, especially if you do have kids and they are going back into the public school system. This is some information you need to be aware about, and you can get that that newsletter for free by signing up right now at Counter Markets. I'm Spiro for ActivistPost.com. Thanks so much for watching.